But especially the Obama and Biden administrations pulled a lot of levers throughout a wide range of agencies and institutions to embed gender identity theory, gender ideology, and gender medicine throughout American healthcare settings. So it's going to take a Herculean effort of the kind that we're starting to see from the Trump administration to uproot it.
Welcome to Undercurrents, our daily news show from Unheard's Washington Bureau. Today's guest is Leor Sapir. Subscribe here wherever you get your podcasts, and please go over to undercurrents.tv and join the community. We put full paywalled episodes over there once a week. We're answering questions. There's a special email address where you can reach us at, and I can answer your questions. So undercurrents.tv, it's just $1 for the first month. Thank you so much for tuning in. Barely 1 week after his inauguration on January 28th, Donald Trump signed an executive order that blocked the federal government from efforts to, quote, fund, sponsor, promote, assist, or support the so-called transition of a child from one sex to another. He directed the government to, quote, rigorously enforce all laws that prohibit or limit these destructive and life-altering procedures. Irreversible Damage author Abigail Shrier wrote, quote, to the practitioners and promoters and numberless devotees of pediatric gender-affirming care, a euphemism for the vast apparatus pushing junk science on vulnerable children and confused families, the executive order came as a much-needed slap in the face. Shrier added, quote, this executive order does not abolish pediatric gender medicine. Boutique practices that do not rely on federal funding can still offer top surgery to minors, for instance. There will surely be litigation to challenge the reach of Trump's order. But that order does break the spell. And the spell was always our biggest problem. End quote. As we reported at Unheard last October, insurance data studied by Do No Harm show at least 5,747 children underwent gender transition surgeries in the U.S. from 2019 to 2023. The group also found that at least 8,500 children received prescriptions for hormones and puberty blockers in that time period as well. Now, interestingly enough, the winter edition of City Journal presciently includes an important story from Leor Sapir, one of trans ideology's most effective and rigorous critics. A second Trump administration, he wrote, quote, will need to get serious about tackling the roots of the crisis. This will mean appointing individuals with experience combating transgender activism and finding ways to remove or curb the influence of unappointed bureaucrats. So what's next? Is this actually the end? Is the spell broken? Leor Sapir, a fellow at the Manhattan Institute, joins us now to discuss. Leor, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me, Emily.
So we're talking now after like a frenzied time period. And in fact, Leor, you told me before we started taping, that's not really after a crazy time period. You're still sort of in it. So you've been working on this issue for so long. Could you just tell us a little bit about what the last few days have been like on your end, watching the Trump administration take steps that are going to significantly curb a problem that felt almost, it almost felt intimidating, impossible not that long ago?
So I think maybe the most important thing to say is that it's pretty clear that this administration comes into office very well prepared. The executive orders, I mean, we've seen a slew of executive orders in the last few days, but just on the issue of, let's call it gender broadly, we've seen a number of executive orders that are very detailed, very well written. Are they perfect? Probably not, but no executive order ever is. But they seem to stem from a nuanced and sophisticated understanding of the problem. Let's narrow it down to gender medicine, the problem of gender medicine, how it's become embedded throughout a wide range of institutions, the incentive structure within which it operates, and what really needs to happen in order to dislodge that ideology, to get its grip off of the American medical community. And we're already starting to see some effects. I mean, just in the last 24 to 48 hours, we've seen so far 3 hospitals that I'm aware of announce publicly that they are discontinuing their pediatric sex change offers. They're not offering those procedures anymore. So that's a welcome change, obviously. I think it's very important for people to understand that this was never a matter of, the medical community just embraced these procedures, these treatments, independent of government power. the Obama and Biden administrations, and to some extent, even the first Trump administration, kind of the lower level bureaucracy, the type of bureaucrats that people in the White House would have very little ability to control if they don't come in with a very sophisticated understanding of the problem. But especially the Obama and Biden administrations pulled a lot of levers throughout a wide range of agencies and institutions to embed gender identity theory, gender ideology, and gender medicine throughout American healthcare settings. So it's going to take a Herculean effort of the kind that we're starting to see from the Trump administration to uproot it.
Yeah, so that's exactly where I was going to go next. I wanted to ask, if you're sort of someone who's been following this more casually and you're looking at the reality of Trump signing executive orders, having these downstream consequences for hospitals and doctors, you might wonder, well, how does an executive order from the president have such a substantial change? And you just walked us through that a little bit, but can you flesh that out, Leor, a little bit about why it is that an executive order, it's not a big piece of legislation or anything like that. How is that having such a wide scale effect on this industry?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And really, to answer that question, we have to go through the major components of the order. And I'm happy to do that. I think one thing that just needs to be clarified up front, an executive order is an order to the federal bureaucracy, much more than it is an order to the American people or to American institutions. So this kind of signals the president's intent, policy agenda, and it sends directives. And those directives can be very clear and explicit. They can be vague or anything in between to federal agencies that are either explicitly named, as in the case of the executive order of gender medicine, or sometimes you'll see in executive orders that'll say something like all relevant agencies or all agencies with any kind of authority over this issue. So that being said, there's a number of levers that this executive order pulls on to try to uproot gender ideology from US healthcare. The first and probably most important is, of course, funding. It's no secret that the federal government is heavily involved in the funding of US healthcare. And, so we have provisions stating that no Medicaid funding shall be used for so-called gender-affirming care. The Department of Defense shall exclude these procedures from TRICARE, which is the health insurance plan that DoD employees are under. It's 2 million people. And maybe most significantly, no grants to hospitals, clinics, medical institutions, medical schools that in any way support or practice so-called gender-affirming care. And that might be the single most powerful lever that the federal government has here. So, for example, when it was announced the other day that Denver Health in Denver, Colorado is going to stop offering these procedures to minors, it was also reported in the same article that Denver Health receives $98 million a year in federal funding. So, I think ideally what this order is trying to do is put hospitals in a situation where they have to choose between their gender clinic and their funding. Now, is that an ideal situation? No, but you know what? I don't see an alternative. These hospitals have proven themselves unable or unwilling to, I'm not even talking about eliminate their pediatric gender clinics, even just introduce common sense reforms of the kind that we've seen in Europe. They've been utterly unwilling to do so, even in the face of growing, powerful evidence of medical harm, of the lack of any safeguards, guardrails. The hospital administration in these places simply knows that touching its pediatric gender clinic is politically impossible. And so one of the things I hope this order does is give hospital administrators a way out, an off-ramp, so that now they can say, look, the federal government is forcing us to choose between shutting down our whole hospital because we want to have money and shutting down our gender clinic. So, faced with that choice, hopefully it'll be a little bit easier. But anyway, the funding is by far, I think, the most potent weapon that the federal government has here. And, there's no reason why American taxpayers should be supporting these procedures, not just because they're unethical and harmful, but also because this is taxpayer money. And the majority of Americans, including, a strong plurality of Democrats, disapprove of these procedures in minors. The second lever has to do with Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act. And for those not familiar, the Affordable Care Act passed along strict partisan lines in 2010, also known as Obamacare, included a provision called Section 1557. And what that provision does is essentially imports Title IX, which is a federal law from 1972 that prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex in education. It imports Title IX into US healthcare law. And so the law says you may not discriminate on the basis of sex in healthcare settings in any way in which, a regulated entity receives federal funding or, is associated with federal programs in any way. And so immediately after this law was passed, activists and the Obama administration itself, and then later the Biden administration, interpreted Section 1557, just as they had been doing with Title IX, to mean discrimination on the basis of sex means discrimination on the basis of gender identity. So the argument became, if hospitals offer, for example, breast reduction procedures for men with enlarged breasts, they also have to offer double mastectomies for women who identify as men, because the only difference between those two scenarios is, quote, gender identity. That became the argument. Now, it's hard for me to exaggerate how important Section 1557 has been in US healthcare settings in shaping the healthcare decisions of hospitals and clinics. And the reason for that is what I've called in my writings the gender affirming care racket. So the way it works is you have vague legal provisions, and these are vague legal provisions. They don't explicitly tell hospitals which procedures to offer to whom, when, and under what circumstances. They just declare these kind of, abstract principles of no discrimination on the basis of gender identity. Well, what does that mean? If you're a hospital administrator, you're not sure what that means. You're not sure when a certain type of practice is going to run afoul of civil rights law and potentially threaten your funding. And so the rational thing for you to do is to try to defer to the very organizations, activist groups that are going to be the ones to sue you. Human Rights Campaign, Lambda Legal, and so on and so forth. And any organization in their network that comes in and says, here, if you do these particular things, we'll hold back the dogs. We'll make sure that they don't go after you, they don't sue you, and they don't drag you through the mud with an embarrassing and expensive civil rights investigation or lawsuit. And so sure enough, the Human Rights Campaign, the largest and most powerful LGBT lobby in the United States, I shouldn't say LGBT because now it's all just TQ, has what it calls the Health Equality Index. And it assigns scores to hospitals based on how much they comply with HRC's own criteria for being inclusive and equitable. And that, of course, includes offering gender affirming care on its health plans, in its clinics, and so on and so forth. And so this is a racket, right? The government creates a vague legal structure with a credible threat of litigation or investigation. And hospitals, risk-averse hospital administrators defer to activist groups in implementing policies that Democrats would never dream of being able to get away with. So the fact that this executive order instructs the Department of Health and Human Services to do away with this shenanigans related to Section 57 is hugely important for shaping the incentive structure of American medicine.
It's incredible to think about how much of this, even when we're talking about education, John King saying Title IX must be interpreted to include gender identity. So in a Dear Colleague letter, so much of this was funneled through the bureaucracy because Democrats, to the point you just made, never would have been able to actually pass the Equality Act. And so now it's just as simple as sort of flipping the switch back. And not that that's simple. I mean, it's not an easy thing to do. It requires, to your point, like a lot of preparation, as we saw the Trump administration come in with. But it's wild how much of this was just switch flipping in the first place.
Yeah, that's right. And, we have to wait and see what happens in the courts. This being the United States, everything gets resolved in the courts, right? And I saw Chase Strangio is already fishing for clients on social media saying, if this order affects you in any way, shape, or form, get in touch with me, right? So there's no doubt that we're going to see a torrent of lawsuits. We've already seen a few lawsuits filed on some of the executive orders. And so, I think one possible scenario here is a federal court issues a nationwide injunction blocking the executive order or any rules or policy declarations made pursuant thereof with a temporary injunction. So a nationwide block pending kind of a full trial on the merits. The problem, of course, is that there's a case before the Supreme Court right now, U.S. versus Skermeti, that raises exactly the question of the constitutionality of bans on youth gender transition. And if, as we all expect, the court will side with Tennessee, whether it's 5-4, 6-3, who knows, and declare that these restrictions are in fact constitutional, it's hard to see how a nationwide injunction blocking enforcement of this executive order could continue to remain in place. So a lot of the action here is going to get rolled to the courts, and we'll have to see what happens. But there's two additional components of this executive order that I think are worth mentioning. One is the order takes aim explicitly at what it calls reliance on junk science. And it mentions, of course, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health and its standards of care. And it instructs HHS to, quote, publish a review of the existing literature on best practices for promoting the health of children who assert gender dysphoria, rapid onset gender dysphoria, or other identity-based confusion within 90 days. Now you wonder, like, how can HHS write such a comprehensive report in 90 days? Well, one thing it could do is borrow heavily from the Cass review, updating as necessary. For example, we've had 2 new systematic reviews of evidence from McMaster University come out since the Cass review came out, confirming exactly the same conclusions. I would hope that they could introduce some of the elements of the Cass review with language that's a little bit more scientific and precise, because the Cass review does rely to some extent on this kind of ideologically loaded language. And of course, tailor the recommendations to the US healthcare system, because part of the Cass review is making recommendations for the UK health system. But that's another component. So they're trying to kind of establish a new standard for medical practice. And then the final component involves the Department of Justice. So interestingly, it mentions it instructs DOJ to see what can be done using an existing federal ban on female genital mutilation, with fines and up to 10 years in prison for clinicians who perform procedures like that. Now, of course, this would have an extremely limited application in this context, because from everything we've seen, the number of women getting phalloplasty remains very, very small. But still, it's an important tool. It's a grotesque procedure that really should never happen. And so we'll see if DOJ actually uses that provision. It also tells the DOJ to see what can be done in terms of consumer protection, meaning fraud. And as you probably know, anybody who's followed this issue even a little bit knows that the entire field of gender medicine is built on fraud. If you don't believe me, just read an article called The Myth of Reliable Research, which really kind of is a peer-reviewed critical examination of the foundational studies in the field, foundational study, I should say, in the field, and shows that it's fraudulent through and through. And then finally, on the DOJ front, the executive order instructs the DOJ to protect whistleblowers. And this is, they probably have in mind people like Eitan Haim, the doctor who was just let off the hook, who blew the whistle on child sex change operations and procedures at Texas Children's Hospital in Dallas. But it also includes, kind of the more classic case of whistleblowers, people who file complaints in court about Medicaid fraud. So the use of fraudulent billing practices, diagnostic coding, things like that, to bill Medicaid, meaning taxpayers, right, for these procedures. And we know that these things exist. Sometimes doctors, gender clinicians themselves admit it. So the hope here is, I think, that you'll have claims, what are known as qui tam claims, brought under the False Claims Act, which can result in massive settlements. And the reason it hasn't been done up until now is because if you are, let's say you're a nurse who sees these fraudulent billing practices happening in a gender clinic at your hospital, the procedure to become a whistleblower is you need to file a complaint and basically alert the Department of Justice, at which point the Department of Justice can either take over the case for you or allow you to continue pursuing the case in court on its behalf. Either way, the DOJ has to give its approval. And of course, under the Biden administration, there's no way in which the DOJ would have given its approval. So I think you're going to see quite a few of these False Claims Act being lodged against hospitals right now. And they, there's serious penalties attached to that. So anyway, that's kind of, I think, in the broadest sense, what this executive order tries to do and the different levers it can pull. So you could see why it would be very effective.
It's incredibly helpful to have you lay that all out. And I'm thinking now about, what was this, May, June of 2015, when Donald Trump first announced he was running for office. Actually, interestingly enough, coincided with the Caitlyn Jenner 2020 interview. I think it was 2020, where Caitlyn Jenner said that this was a gender transition. It's sort of like, I'm curious what you make of this, actually, Leor, but for me, that was like the moment when culture started to shift. There was a lot percolating before it that people forget about, but it seemed to me like that was the moment this burst into pop culture and went mainstream. And not only is Donald Trump coming into this administration with years of preparation from lawyers and policy people who basically drafted these EOs before he even was inaugurated, but I think we've learned so much since 2017. And again, I'm very curious what your take is on that, because Trump, when he was running in the primary, said he would let Caitlyn Jenner use the women's room at Trump Tower and, in a way sort of neutralized debate on that issue at the time. I mean, we could talk about that, but without getting too much into it, it just seems to me like there was a shift. The New York Times started covering this differently. And how much of that, from your perspective, stemmed from actually getting things like the cast review and more research? Research we probably never should have had to have done, but research that was done nonetheless. Is that what kind of broke the spell, as Abigail Shrier puts it?
Yeah, I mean, just as the factors that led to this ideology becoming embedded within American society and, of course, other Western countries across a wide range of institutions, just as those factors are complex, multifaceted, this in the same way, kind of the period of detox that we're starting to see right now is very complex. It involves ideas as well as incentives, and I think we're going to continue to see it play out in the years ahead. But yeah, I mean, I don't claim to have any insight into Donald Trump's mind. I don't know what he's thinking. I don't know what makes him tick. But he does seem to be, like many Americans, kind of instinctually libertarian about these things, meaning live and let live. As long as people are not harming others, they should be allowed to do what they want to do. And that, I think, probably explains, maybe partly explains, his support for Caitlyn Jenner. And I think one thing that kind of we all collectively have realized over the last 10 years, which is the reason why I often refer to the contemporary transgender movement as opposed to the transgender movement, let's say pre-2014. I would actually date it at 2014 rather than 2015. 2014 is when I think it was 2014 when Time magazine ran the cover story of the transgender tipping point. Even the term tipping point is a little bizarre because it implies that there's kind of widespread public agitation leading to a certain point in time. I think there's a greater sense now that the contemporary transgender movement, the kind of the revolution in our social institutions that we've all witnessed over recent years, was really brought about seemingly out of nowhere. I mean, a lot of my work has focused on how it bubbled up through the administrative state in a way that very, very few people were paying attention to because they couldn't pay attention to it. But look, I mean, to get to your question of what's going to dislodge this, yeah, there have been some very important events in recent years. I mean, to take just 2024 alone, which I think was by far the most influential year in kind of pushing back against gender ideology in medicine. Think about, and I just wrote a piece about this for City Journal. I mean, think about the major events that we had during that year. Of course, the most important, maybe, on an international scale, was the cast review published in April. The cast review is significant because it makes it no longer possible to say or pretend, and I think that there was a lot more pretending than saying, that this issue is, medical authorities on the one hand versus conservative politicians on the other. That framing is no longer possible except for, kind of in the activist circles in media after the cast review. Now there's absolutely no question that the controversy is within the medical community. It's a scientific controversy, a medical controversy, an ethical controversy, not merely a political one. So that's, I think, the main contribution of the cast review. And of course, the cast review became the basis for a bipartisan effort in the UK, in England, and then later on in Scotland, and I think Wales as well, to impose a ban, essentially, on puberty blockers. The second very important event of 2024 was the Alabama disclosure. In the case of Boe versus Marshall, this is where the federal judge in that case authorized the subpoena for all internal communications at WPATH related to the development of its standard of care. Essentially, the U.S. government was arguing, the Biden administration was arguing, we trust the medical experts, and the organization that represents medical expertise on this issue is WPATH with this standard of care. And so Alabama said, if that's their argument, let's see how the sausage was made. Show your work. And the judge agreed and subpoenaed, I think it was something like 2 million documents. And of course, what we discovered there is the smoking gun evidence of the medical scandal, right? We all knew that this was a medical scandal. Those of us who had devoted a significant amount of time to looking through the footnotes and checking references and looking at clinical practice guidelines knew that things had gone badly wrong. But it wasn't really until we saw that WPATH, in its own words, admitted that it was suppressing evidence, that it was only involving clinicians with significant conflicts of interest, that it was consulting, and I quote, social justice lawyers when drafting its recommendations, that it was eliminating age minimums due to pressure from Rachel Levin, the Assistant Secretary for Health, and the American Academy of Pediatrics. It's only when we saw WPATH admit these things privately that I think it became no longer possible to deny. And so the third major event, in my view, is when the American Society of Plastic Surgeons officially broke from the consensus that there is strong evidence supporting these interventions. And I think a number of factors made it possible for ASPS to do so, the Cass review being one, the discovery from Alabama being another. We at the Manhattan Institute published first of its kind data documenting the incidence of double mastectomy on teenage girls in the weeks ahead of, actually, I published it in the same article in which I got the quote from ASPS that they don't recognize, basically that they agree with the Cass review, right? So all of this was important. It all kind of happened at the same time. And then, of course, we have Skermeti in December, the oral arguments, and there have been, of course, other developments in 2024. But those, I think, are the major three. And so we've definitely turned a corner. And so the Trump administration comes into office with all of these victories already under our belt, so to speak. And maybe most importantly, the American public opinion has shifted significantly. This is now a 70-30 issue, with 70% of the American public believing that minors simply should not be allowed to undergo these treatments. And even of the 30% who think they should, a percentage of them believe that under 15, no kid should be able to access these treatments. So this is a rare issue in American politics that enjoys widespread consensus.
Well, my last question is a big one, but I looked back recently because I had this hazy memory of a report from 2017 of Betsy DeVos when she was newly installed as education secretary being somewhat hesitant to roll back the Title IX conflation of sex with gender identity. I think it was in the Washington Post. And I guess when I look back on moments like that or the Trump Tower, Caitlyn Jenner situation, I remember how many conservatives like myself, or how often conservatives like myself would say this is deeply entrenched in our federal bureaucracy, as you have studied for years, in our medical bureaucracy. This comes from personnel that was exported from college campuses and imported into positions of middle management and increasingly positions of power. And I guess, to your point about how public opinion has shifted, I also wonder if we're now in like a sleeper cell moment where Donald Trump has power and it feels like there's a cultural vibe shift. So people are sort of allowing things to be rolled back. But fundamentally, they don't believe that men and women are like biologically different. There are a lot of people who like genuinely have this ideological sort of Judith Butler perspective on sex. Maybe I'm wrong. I'm just sort of trying to work this out. And I'm curious what you make of this as somebody who studied it so closely. Are there like sleeper cells through all of our institutions, or if people's minds really changed?
Yes. I mean, of course, there's going to be federal bureaucrats at all levels, maybe except for the highest, who continue to be true believers and will do everything they can to #resist, right? I mean, I think that's inevitable. And a big challenge for the Trump administration, just as for any incoming administration, is how to get how to enforce the president's agenda throughout the executive branch, right? I mean, that's the president is the one who is elected. He's the one who faces the popular vote. And so it's his agenda that the executive branch has to execute. That's kind of how our constitutional system of government works. But the executive branch is so massive and so sprawling that it's often difficult to do that. And then also there's that pesky reality of federalism. At the end of the day, the federal government only has so much power. I mean, under our Constitution, the 10th Amendment to the Constitution leaves the regulation of medicine to the states. And in fact, all of these state laws and the litigation challenging the state laws that restrict gender medicine for kids, all of that is happening in the shadow of the 10th Amendment. So it'd be a little difficult for the Trump administration to try to kind of ban it all, or even for Congress to try to ban it all. That could probably run into constitutional problems. So yes, there's a problem there. And I think the biggest challenge, of course, in the years ahead, especially if Skrmetti comes out the way that we expect, the biggest challenge is going to be the blue states that are going to fight tooth and nail, I think. And part of the reason why Democrats in deep blue states like California, Oregon, New York, Massachusetts, Washington, part of the reason they're going to fight this tooth and nail is because of how our political system works. And by that, I mean voters with more polarized views who skew much more to the left in this case than the median voter have an outsized influence in electing politicians because of how our primary system works. And this is a kind of a leftover legacy of the 1968 election, the 1972 McGovern-Fraser Commission. I mean, it gets complicated. But being able to tackle these problems really requires some creative thinking about how the US political system works and how to get around it. But I'm already getting kind of sidetracked from your question. So I think there was an aspect of your question that I may not have answered.
Well, no, I mean, there's so many people that I genuinely believe were propagandized in their formative years to this worldview that is so deeply personal on just like it became their kind of moral compass that you would be sort of this. I mean, we started calling it wokeness, but as a society, we sort of landed on the word woke, but it's very real. It's not, just something that is going to go away.
Yeah, so I did get very sidetracked. Okay, yes, so that's a very good question. Look, I'm of the belief that people tend to exaggerate the extent to which kind of Americans have bought into the ideas, fully and sincerely bought into the ideas of gender ideology. I think the vast majority of Americans don't actually believe that sex is a social construct. With regard to gender identity, maybe you do have kind of a more even split of people who believe that gender identity is a real thing. Of course, once you ask them to define what they mean by gender identity, they twist themselves into a pretzel because you can't define it in a way that's logical and does not rely on stereotypes, right? And they don't want to rely on stereotypes, so you can quite easily point that out. But they just kind of take it at face value. They absorb it through osmosis from the culture. They just say, all right, well, some people, and including some kids, just have a gender identity that's different from their sex. But I think setting aside Americans who know that all of this is just ideological claptrap, and setting aside on the other side those who are true believers, kind of a small minority of Judith Butler following true believers. Although I should mention, Judith Butler herself doesn't believe in the concept of gender ideology as that concept has become popularized in mainstream culture and used in medicine. To attribute that particular understanding of gender identity to Judith Butler is just a category error. She explicitly denies it, at least in her early writings. But in the middle, that mushy middle of American public opinion, I think you probably have kind of the general disposition is, look, I don't understand these issues, but I want to be kind. I want to be nice. So I'm just going to go along with them until something better comes along, or until kind of my peer group signals to me that it's okay for me to believe what maybe I, in my heart of hearts, know is true.
No, that's very interesting. Leor, it was great to actually go through a lot of this with you, since you've covered it so closely and studied it so closely. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for tuning in to Undercurrents. As a reminder, if you head over to undercurrents.tv, it's just $1 for your first month. You can join the community. You can get a paywalled premium episode every week. We're answering your questions over there. There's a special email address you get if you are a premium subscriber to reach us. To reach me, I'm happy to answer those questions. I love doing it. Thank you for tuning into today's episode. As a reminder, subscribe here on the YouTube channel. Subscribe wherever you download your podcasts. If you're listening to this, like I love listening to podcasts myself, we appreciate you tuning in, and we will be back soon with more Undercurrents.